What is the ultimate betrayal? Is it a broken promise from a friend, a lie from a lover, or is it something far more sinister? Imagine a doctor, a figure of absolute trust, a man who has sworn an oath to heal. Now imagine that doctor looks you in the eye, promises you free healthcare, promises to cure the bad blood that is ravaging your community, and then, for the next 40 years, he secretly watches as a deadly disease consumes you from the inside out. This is not a work of fiction. This is the true declassified story of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. It is the story of 600 impoverished African-American men in rural Alabama who were told they were receiving treatment, but were in fact the unwitting subjects of a 4-decade-long government experiment designed to do one thing: to chart the brutal natural progression of untreated syphilis, all the way to the autopsy table. This is a psychological autopsy of a medical crime so profound, so racist, and so cruel, it has left a permanent scar on the soul of a nation. To understand how this nightmare was possible, we must first travel to Macon County, Alabama, in the year 1932. This was the heart of the Great Depression, and for the poor, black sharecroppers of the rural South, it was a world of profound and inescapable hardship. They lived in a society defined by the brutal realities of segregation and systemic poverty. They worked the land of white owners for a pittance, were often illiterate, and had virtually no access to any form of modern healthcare. A simple infection could be a death sentence. In this landscape of desperation, the United States Public Health Service arrived, not as healers, but as hunters. The PHS had a problem. They wanted to study the full, devastating course of the sexually transmitted disease, syphilis, from initial infection to death. But the recent discovery of effective treatments in the 1920s meant that their pool of untreated subjects was disappearing. They needed a control group. They needed a population of human beings who were sick, who were isolated, and who were desperate enough to trust them without question. They found their perfect subjects in the poor, uneducated black men of Macon County. The recruitment began under the guise of a benevolent government program. Officials went out into the community, to churches and cotton fields, and offered the men a deal that sounded like a miracle. They were promised free health care from real government doctors. This included free physical exams, free transportation to and from the clinic, hot meals on the days of their examinations, and, most cruelly of all, free treatment for their ailments. For men who had never seen a doctor in their lives, this was an offer they could not refuse. Hundreds of men signed up. The study ultimately enrolled 600 men, 399 who had already contracted syphilis, and a control group of 201 who did not. They were told they were being treated for bad blood, a local colloquial term used to describe a whole range of ailments, from anemia to fatigue to syphilis itself. The vagueness of the term was a deliberate act of deception. Let us conduct a psychological autopsy on this initial act. This was a crime that was built on the foundation of trust. The men trusted the government. They trusted the doctors in their white coats. They believed, with all their hearts, that they were finally receiving the care and respect that had been denied to them their entire lives. They proudly called it Miss Evers Boys, after the compassionate local nurse who served as the liaison for the study. But there was no treatment. The physical exams were a sham. The pills they were given were placebos, simple aspirin and mineral supplements. The painful spinal taps they were subjected to were presented as a special treatment, when in reality, they were a diagnostic procedure designed only to collect data for the study. The doctors were not healers. They were observers, cold, detached scientists, watching a deadly disease run its course, all while pretending to offer a cure. The greatest betrayal in American medical history had begun, and it would continue, in secret, for the next 40 years. For the first 15 years of the study, the doctors of the Public Health Service could, with some twisted logic, justify their inaction. While treatments for early-stage syphilis existed, they were highly toxic and of limited effectiveness. The scientists could argue, however disingenuously, that they were simply observing a disease for which there was no reliable cure. But in the mid-1940s, that justification was obliterated forever by one of the greatest medical discoveries in human history, penicillin. By 1947, penicillin had become the universally recognized, highly effective, and widely available cure for syphilis. It was a medical miracle. Across the country, rapid treatment centers were established to eradicate the disease. The cure that the men of Macon County had been promised for over a decade was now a reality, available to all. This presented the scientists of the Tuskegee study with a profound moral and ethical crossroads. Their experiment, which was supposed to chart the full, natural course of untreated syphilis, was now obsolete. They had the cure. Their duty, both as doctors and as human beings, was clear. They had to end the study and treat the men. They did the opposite. From a psychological perspective, this is the moment when the study's organizers transformed from passive deceivers into active, monstrous criminals. They made a deliberate, conscious decision to view the men not as patients, but as a priceless, non-renewable resource. Their dataset was unique in the world, and they were not going to let a miracle cure interfere with their precious experiment. What followed was a conspiracy of terrifying scale and efficiency. The Public Health Service actively worked to ensure that the 399 men in their study would never receive penicillin. They sent a list of their subjects' names to the Alabama State Health Department with explicit instructions to exclude them from any treatment programs. They went to local doctors throughout Macon County and bribed them, offering to continue the men's free health care in exchange for their promise not to treat them with this new, life-saving drug. When the United States military began drafting soldiers for World War II, many of the men from the study were called to serve. During their physical examinations, the Army diagnosed them with syphilis and ordered them to receive the standard penicillin treatment before they could be deployed. But the Tuskegee study intervened. They secretly contacted the men's local draft boards and had them excluded from service. Not to protect them, but to ensure they would remain untreated, preserving the purity of their experiment. This is the anatomy of a profound and racist betrayal. The doctors, the government, the local medical community, the entire system conspired to deny these men a cure that could have saved their lives. They saw these 399 African American men not as human beings with a right to health, but as a collection of walking data points, a living laboratory to be observed until the final, inevitable endpoint of the disease. Blindness, insanity, heart failure, and death. The lie was no longer just a sin of omission. It had become an active, ongoing crime against humanity. And so, the years turned into decades. The world outside of Macon County, Alabama, changed in profound ways. The civil rights movement rose and fought for justice. A man landed on the moon. But within the isolated, closed ecosystem of the Tuskegee study, time stood still. The lie, born in the desperation of the Great Depression, was allowed to fester and grow, becoming a permanent and monstrous fixture in the lives of its victims. As the men aged, the true, horrifying purpose of the study came into focus. The doctors were no longer just observing the initial stages of syphilis. They were now meticulously documenting its final, brutal, and inevitable act. The slow, systematic destruction of the human body. The men, still believing they were receiving free treatment for bad blood, began to suffer the devastating consequences of tertiary syphilis. They developed deep, painful ulcers that ate away at their skin and bones. They began to go blind. They developed crippling cardiovascular problems, their hearts and aortas weakened by the disease. And, most terrifyingly, many of them descended into madness as the syphilis bacteria attacked their central nervous systems, a condition known as neurosyphilis. From a psychological perspective, the cruelty of this phase is almost impossible to comprehend. The men were not just dying, they were dying in a state of profound confusion. They would go to the government doctors, the men in the white coats, and present their horrifying symptoms, begging for help, and the doctors would lie. They would nod sympathetically, take their notes for the study, and then send the men home with another bottle of useless aspirin or iron tonic, telling them it was the best medicine available. They were trapped in a medical gaslighting campaign of unimaginable scale. The central figure in this ongoing deception was a woman named Eunice Rivers, the African-American nurse who had been with the study since its inception. She was the face of the program, the trusted liaison between the white doctors and the black community. She was Miss Evers. She was the one who drove the men to their appointments, who sat with them, who held their hands. The men trusted her completely. She was one of them. The psychology of Nurse Rivers is one of the most complex and tragic aspects of this entire story. Was she a monster, a willing accomplice in a racist crime? The truth is more complicated. She was a woman in an impossible position, a black nurse in the deeply segregated South, working for a powerful white government institution. To defy the doctors would have meant the end of her career, and perhaps even worse. Over the decades, she likely developed a profound form of cognitive dissonance, convincing herself that she was helping the men by providing them with the only care they had ever known: the hot meals, the transportation, the human contact, while actively participating in the denial of the cure that would have saved them. She was both a caregiver and a captor, a figure of profound compassion and profound betrayal. As the men in the study began to die, the true scientific prize came into view for the researchers: the autopsy. In their final cruel act of deception, the Public Health Service offered to pay for the men's funerals. It was presented as a final act of charity. But this charity came with a condition: the family had to consent to a full autopsy before the burial. The families, grateful for the financial help in their time of grief, almost always agreed. And so the doctors finally got what they had been waiting for: a chance to harvest the organs, to slice open the bodies, and to observe the full, horrifying extent of the disease's wrath. The men had been treated as lab rats in life, and they remained so in death. By the late 1960s, the world had changed, but the Tuskegee study had not. It continued its grim work, a relic of a bygone era of medical ethics, operating in the shadows of the modern civil rights movement. But within the system, a conscience was stirring. A young social scientist and epidemiologist at the Public Health Service in San Francisco, a man named Peter Buxton, stumbled upon the study. He was not a doctor, but a former venereal disease investigator, and what he read in the reports from Tuskegee horrified him. From a psychological perspective, Buxton was the antithesis of the doctors who had run the study for decades, where they had become desensitized, seeing the men as mere data points. He saw them as human beings. Where they saw a valuable scientific experiment, he saw an act of profound and ongoing moral depravity. He could not accept the cold, detached logic that justified the suffering of these men. In 1966, and again in 1968, Peter Buxton did what a person of conscience is supposed to do. He wrote official letters of protest to his superiors at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the agency that now oversaw the Public Health Service. He argued that the study was massively unethical, that it was a cesspool of moral rot, and that it had to be stopped immediately. The response from the system was swift and predictable. He was told, in no uncertain terms, that this was not his concern. He was informed that a committee had reviewed the study, and had decided to continue it until all the original subjects had died and been autopsied. The wall of institutional denial was absolute. The system was protecting itself. Buxton, faced with this official stonewalling, was now at a crossroads. He could remain silent, protect his career, and allow the horror to continue. Or he could risk everything and take the story to the one institution that the government could not control: the free press. In 1972, he made his choice. He contacted a friend who worked as a journalist, who in turn put him in touch with an investigative reporter for the Associated Press named Jean Heller. Heller was a tenacious and brilliant journalist. When she first heard the story from Buxton, she was in a state of disbelief. Could the United States government really have been running a secret, 40-year-long non-treatment study on its own citizens? It sounded like a conspiracy theory, but as Buxton provided her with the internal documents, the medical reports, and the names, she realized the horrifying truth. This was not a theory, it was a fact. Jean Heller's subsequent investigation was a masterpiece of journalism. She corroborated the story, she found the families of the victims, and she prepared to blow the whistle on a national scale. On the morning of July 25, 1972, her story ran on the front page of the New York Times. The headline was an explosion. Syphilis victims in our study went untreated for 40 years. The effect was instantaneous and cataclysmic. The story was picked up by every major news outlet in the country. The public reacted with a wave of shock, disbelief, and profound outrage. The secret, which had been protected by a conspiracy of silence for 4 decades, was now exposed to the bright, unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study, the longest and most infamous experiment in American medical history, was about to come to a swift and ignominious end. The public outcry following Jean Heller's was immediate and immense. The revelation that the United States government had deliberately allowed hundreds of its own citizens to suffer and die for the sake of a scientific study sent shockwaves across the nation and around the world. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study became a symbol of medical racism, ethical bankruptcy, and the profound abuse of power. From a psychological perspective, the exposure of the study shattered the trust that the African American community had placed in the medical establishment. It confirmed long-held suspicions of systemic racism and fueled a deep-seated skepticism that persists to this day. The betrayal was not just medical, it was a profound violation of human dignity and a devastating blow to the very notion of equality and justice. The immediate consequences of the scandal were swift. A special advisory panel was convened by the Assistant Secretary for Health and Scientific Affairs. Their report was damning. concluding that the study was ethically unjustified, and that the decision to continue it after the availability of penicillin was medically indefensible. In 1973, a class action lawsuit was filed on behalf of the study participants and their families. The government eventually settled the case out of court for $10 million and promised to provide lifetime medical benefits to the survivors and their descendants. While this settlement provided some financial relief, it could never fully compensate for the decades of suffering, the premature deaths, and the erosion of trust. In the years that followed, the Tuskegee study became a touchstone for discussions on medical ethics and research practices. It directly led to the strengthening of regulations regarding informed consent, the establishment of institutional review boards (IRBs) to oversee research involving human subjects, and a renewed focus on protecting vulnerable populations in medical studies. The lessons learned from Tuskegee, though born from tragedy, have had a lasting impact on the ethical conduct of scientific research worldwide. In 1997, after decades of silence, President Bill Clinton issued a formal apology to the survivors of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study and their families. In a moving ceremony at the White House, he acknowledged the government's wrongdoing and expressed deep regret for the shameful and clearly racist experiment. While the apology was a significant step towards reconciliation, it could not erase the pain and the legacy of distrust that the study had created. The story of the Tuskegee Syphilis Study serves as a chilling reminder of the potential for science, when divorced from ethics and compassion, to inflict unimaginable harm. It is a testament to the importance of vigilance, transparency, and the unwavering commitment to the fundamental principle that every human life has inherent worth and dignity, and that no individual should ever be treated as a means to an end, especially not in the name of science or progress. The scars of Tuskegee remain, a solemn and enduring warning etched into the history of American medicine. Subscribe for more explorations into the anatomy of dread and historical injustices.